Why hello my Mercurial mercenaries. This is going to be a long video, bit of a ramble, but too long didn't read. The new remaster of Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band to coincide with the 50th anniversary is good. There you go. You don't need to watch any more. You can press the thumbs down and move on. Thank you very much. For the rest of you, I just want to talk about it, all right? So let's do it. This is just a little chat, a to and fro between me and you. So, Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band released on the 26th of May 1967. Therefore, a few days ago was the 50th anniversary. And a remaster was put out there. A new remaster. Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was originally released in mono in 1967. Mono was the preferred option by the Beatles. The mono release was the release that the Beatles spent a lot of time mixing and mastering. However, at that time, a stereo version was also put out, and that's the version that we've all pretty much become accustomed to. The weird version where instruments are coming solely out of one speaker and solely out of another, and some songs the vocals are only coming out of one speaker. And that's the version, a remastered version, that was first put out on CD, on compact disc in 1987, which also seems quite recent to me, but if you think about it, it's a long time ago. 30 years ago. 30 years ago. It was 30 years ago today. If you think about it, when it was originally released on CD, that would have been 20 years after, 67, 77, 87, 20 years after it was originally released on, well, the original release. So it literally was, when you listen to Sergeant Pepper's CD back then, it really literally was 20 years ago today. It was 20 years ago today when Sergeant Pepper was first released. As I was saying, that was the version we were used to. And it was quite useful in some ways, because you could just purely listen to Paul's vocals, or you could take the vocals right out by putting the balance. Remember balance on between speakers, something that you don't really have anymore. You could just listen to the left speaker only and just sing along with it. Take the vocals out. People have been messing around with Beatles songs over the years purely because of that weird stereo panning. But anyway, to celebrate the 50th anniversary of one of the greatest albums of all time, it has been remastered by Giles Martin, who is the son of George Martin. And when you think about the Beatles, and especially Sergeant Pepper, you have to say that Sergeant Pepper was the product of those 5-6 people. You know, you had the Beatles, and you had George Martin, and you had the engineer, and they, between them, created something that was spectacular. And anyone who's into music can probably appreciate the importance of Sergeant Pepper. But what Giles Martin has done with this new version of Sergeant Pepper, he's produced something that fits in with the modern age. Now, I've already spoken about this on a previous video, but the difference here is that whereby on that previous video I'd only heard a snippet of, with a little help from my friends on the radio, which caught my attention and made me think, wow, this is going to be great. I have now listened to the new version a lot of times. I've listened to it about 5, 6 times through. And I also went back and listened to the original stereo CD version from 1987. And I also went back and listened to the remaster that they did in 2009, I think, on CD. So I'm pretty much acquainted with all the various versions of Sergeant Pepper. Not so much the mono version, all right? I admit it. But when it comes to the stereo versions and it comes to Sergeant Pepper in general, I know it, all right? I do know it. Sergeant Pepper. It's a whimsical album. It always reminds me of the fairground. It reminds me of... It's got old-fashionedness to it, which is interesting because when I was first getting into music, when I was a teenager, you heard about bands that you had to listen to, that you were supposed to like. So you kind of went out of your way to listen to the Rolling Stones and the Who, and Aerosmith. Well, why not? An Aerosmith and the Beatles. And funny enough, back then you felt like you had to listen to this magical album which you'd heard so much about, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And when you did listen to it, it sounded quaint and old-fashioned. And when you get a bit of musical know-how and you now analyse it in the modern light of day, you can see that even back then in 1967, the Beatles were trying to be old-fashioned and quaint. Songs like When I'm 64 and that era of Penny Lane, it's supposed to sound quaint even then. And my forever love of nostalgia means that quaint back then equals sheer brilliance now. So what does this new remix by Giles Martin that was released a few days ago bring? What does it bring? What does it bring that's different? For a start, it does bring more punch. It brings more volume. It brings more modernity to something that we've just discussed as being old and quaint. Now, I had the misfortune of reading a few kind of audiophile record collector sites where they've been discussing this latest release, and the general consensus is that it's had the dynamics crushed out of it, and it's an appalling mess, and it's tiring on the ears. And if you've got really decent record playing equipment, you know, the sort of thing that costs £100,000, then this new recording is a travesty. But that's not the reality. I did a video not long ago where I was talking about how the loudness wars, in a way, are a little bit of bollocks. And this album kind of sums up what I was trying to say there. I got a little bit mixed up in what I was saying, and I've had a little bit of criticism, but what I was basically trying to say, if you boil it down to its essence, to its man fluid, I was trying to say that trying to make music loud and punchy does not mean that it has to sound inherently bad. That's basically what I was trying to say. Reducing the dynamic range of something doesn't always mean it's going to sound bad. And in fact, some recordings that are held aloft as examples of crushed dynamics actually have the same dynamics, they're just louder. Anyway, when it comes to this new recording, and if you hear a lot of negatives about how loud it is and how brash it is and how the dynamics have been crushed, take them with a pinch of salt, like you should take all advice. Just remember, I'm anti-advice. Your relative that likes to spout advice, anti-advice. This new recording, just to sum it up, it sounds great. It sounds great. But why does it sound great, I hear you ask, Mercurial number 6? Tell us more. Okay, why does the new recording of Sgt. Pepper sound great? Here we go. Sip of coffee. For a start, the weird panning, having vocals coming out of one speaker and instruments coming out of the other, that's all changed. It's been corrected. Pinch of salt. Corrected. It now sounds more like most music sounds like. Yes, there'll be loads of criticism of that, but it just sounds more normal, all right? The vocals are coming at you from the center and it all just sounds, it sounds great. The second thing, it's Giles Martin has gone back to the original tapes and he's bypassed all the layers of copy to copy, tape to tape over the years, and he's gone back to the original source material. And because of that, it sounds crystal clear. And because of that, it sounds like it could have been recorded today. Honestly, it sounds like it could have been recorded today. And that first experience I had with a little help from my friends, where I said, on the previous video, I said it could have been recorded today. It really could, and it sounds so fresh. The vocals sound clear, like they could be in the room with you. A veil's been lifted from some of the songs, especially the reprise of Sgt. Pepper, which, listening to the older versions of the CDs, sounds like they've got a blanket over them. It's all muffled. Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. It's now, it's had a hand. The new recording, that's point number 2. The new recording takes a hand away from everybody's bloody mouths. Now it's boom, cha, with Sergeant Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band that could be in the room with you. The drums. No wonder Ringo is so happy with this new recording. It's because the drums are to the fore. When I listen to the older versions, the drums they're stuck away on one speaker and they're kind of hidden underneath everything. The drums are now out. Boom, 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 boom. A Day in the Life. The drums, which have always been one of the best parts of that track, no matter what anyone says, the drums are now out, and they're out with fury. There's flourishes on the drums through the songs that just sound fantastic. Boom, boom, Lucy in the sky with diamonds. That drum beat before that. Boom, 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 boom. Yes. Oh, Ringo. I love you, Ringo. I loved you, Ringo. Peace and love, peace and love. You're a bit of an arse now. No, you're just an arse now, but I can't deny that you're an important man in music history. So I still tip my hat to you. Sip of coffee. What else comes through? I'm not sure which number I'm on now, but the genius of Paul McCartney. The genius of Paul McCartney shines more brightly than it ever has with this album now. This album was pretty much Paul's baby, and he's just fantastic. His singing performances are incredible. Don't let anyone tell you that the Beatles didn't have a decent singer. I've heard that said by a few kind of rock band singers over the years, heavy metal band singers. Oh, I would like the Beatles, but they didn't have a decent singer. They couldn't decide who their singer was. Bollocks. The Beatles had 2, 3 fantastic singers. In fact, John Lennon was at one point, probably still, in some music poll, in some high-class magazine, was rated the #1 singer of all time. So we're talking about a band who's got the #1 singer of all time in it. But this is Paul's album. And Paul sounds incredible. And he gets a lot of stick because he's managed to survive. He's still out there doing stuff. And people have the opportunity to criticise him. Whereas they don't have the opportunity to criticise John Lennon or George Harrison anymore. So Paul McCartney keeps getting it. But Paul McCartney is a genius, is, in my opinion, the greatest living songwriter. And Sgt. Pepper is maybe... I'd have to think about this a little bit more than just off the top of my head, but it's maybe his crowning glory. His vocal performances, his songwriting, his bass playing. Let's talk about the bass on this album. The bass and the drums just hit. And the bass is fantastic. I'm overusing the word fantastic, but the bass is sublime. Paul's got this way of playing the bass. He plays it. He doesn't play the bass like a bass player. Listen to Sgt. Pepper and you can hear it more than ever before, or probably ever after. There are songs where he's milling about, he's playing melodies and he's up the top of the neck and he's playing things that honestly other bassists wouldn't think of playing, but it's second nature to Paul. You put all this together, you put this weird drumming that Ringo does on this album. It's not your typical. He's got elements of typical. The Sgt. Pepper reprise, boom cha, boom boom cha, boom cha, boom boom cha. He's got that. He's got those solid beats. But listen to A Day in the Life and listen to the flourishes throughout the other songs. Ringo he's trying to punctuate in the same way as Keith Moon did a bit, but this isn't so. It's not. This is solid flourishes. Solid flourishes, not wayward flourishes. Solid. Ringo on the drums and Paul McCartney's bass, and this remaster does bring those to the fore. And then, like I said, you've got Paul McCartney's vocals, which are the best he ever sung. You've got John Lennon. John Lennon, I would say... Would you say John Lennon was at the top of his game? Look, put it this way. John Lennon, in retrospect, talked about Sgt. Pepper as being a time that he was coasting and he was churning out songs. And I don't think he was necessarily that happy with Sgt. Pepper. But John said a lot of things over the years. He said a lot of things. He was a very contrary man. And he would say things that suited the circumstance. And if you think about when Sgt. Pepper was recorded, Sgt. Pepper was recorded at a time that John Lennon was doing Strawberry Fields Forever, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, and A Day in the Life. Now, if you consider that churning songs out, then you're a better man than I. So I would say you've got Paul McCartney at the top of his game, and you've probably got John Lennon at the top of his game. And Ringo at the top of his game. And George Harrison, he always felt sidelined, didn't he? He always felt sidelined, but he was getting into the sitar and getting into the Eastern influences, and they gave him Within You, Without You, my least favourite song. And yet, listening to this remaster, it doesn't change everything. It's still the same album, but there's enough there for me to appreciate that song a little more than I used to. Highlights of the album? Fixing a Hole. Historically, when people have spoken about Sgt. Pepper, and I include me in this a little bit, you tend to talk about the classic songs, and then you talk about perhaps an element of filler, whereas perhaps Revolver, Rubber Soul didn't necessarily have that. And the songs that get talked about as being a little bit of filler are the songs I'm going to talk about now, because I think the highlights of this album, Fixing a Hole and Lovely Rita. Fixing a Hole? Wow. Listen to this remaster, listen to Fixing a Hole and tell me that's not a good song. What's that? You're already telling me it's not a good song. It just sounds fantastic. This reissue, this remaster, just does a little bit of that, you know? It's a little tuck. It's a little bit of a tuck there. It's a bit of that. It's not that. It doesn't do that. But it does do that. Lovely Rita. This is an interesting song, isn't it? Never been one of my faves. But having listened to it through like 6 times now on this remaster, I love it. Maybe the highlight of the album. And I heard things here for the first time. So much so I had to go back and listen to the previous versions from different CDs just to see whether it was still there. It has always been there, what I'm about to talk about. It has always been there. So I might sound like a little bit of a fool now, even bringing this up. But I noticed that the climax of the song Lovely Rita has a massive orgasm on it. Yes, it's always been there, and you might be tutting at the screen now, but never has it been... Giles Martin has brought it to the forefront to the point where I was like, what's going on? There's an actual orgasm and a climax in Lovely Rita. I've always thought of Lovely Rita as like a throwaway song, one of Paul's kind of telling a story songs, you know, one of those songs that you hear and you go, yeah, very good, Paul, let's move on. But now I'm sort of hearing it in a new light. And yes, it's whimsical, and yes, it could just be a story. I mean, Paul tells the story that he... a traffic warden, a female traffic warden, was ticketing his car, and rather than get angry, he was really nice with her, and he was really nice to her, and like as you could be if you're a Beatle back then in 1966, 67, and he said he wrote the song from that point of view. However, I don't know. Lovely Rita, meet a maid. Nothing can come between us. Nothing can come between us. And then there's a line, when I'm in the dark, when it's dark, I pull your heart away, or something, suggesting that nothing can come between Paul and this woman. And when it's dark, he will have her heart. Give me a wink and I can think of you. It sounds to me, and this might be putting too much of a spin on it, but it sounds to me like the whole thing is just Paul imagining this woman. He's got this fixation on this woman he's seen. He's got a fixation for women in uniform. Great Iron Maiden cover. Great Only Fools and Horses episode with Rodney. Buying his girlfriend a piece of uniform at a time. You know, he buys her a pair of stockings and then he buys her a little black dress, and then Del Boy says, "What are you going to do? Buy her a pair of handcuffs next? Make her a policewoman, step by step." Lovely Rita meets a maid, nothing can come between us. Give me a wink and I think of you. I've listened to that song a number of times, and there's enough there that makes me think the whole thing is in his head. The whole thing is in his head. It's a tricky one, because there's a later verse where it mentions that he's taken her to dinner and she pays, and then they go back to her place and he nearly makes it with her, but then it ends up that he's just sitting on a sofa with a couple of sisters. There's enough there that makes you think, no, this is like, no, Mercurial number 6, this is like your theory that Columbo hasn't got a wife. And yet there's enough episodes of Columbo where it's quite clear that he must have a wife. But I think there's enough in Lovely Rita. If you give it multiple listens, there's enough in there to think that the whole song is someone who's fixated on a woman and is basically having a wank. It's a masturbatory. It's a masturbatory song. And the end, where the song falls apart, it sounds like it's falling down the stairs. I think there's enough there. Paul is quite a straightforward guy, but if you think about what was going on at these times in the 60s with the Beatles, they were often taking the piss during these songs. Lots of double meanings, and I can imagine people will say, no, it's just a simple song about someone's simple love for a traffic warden. I'm not so sure. There's a few lines in there that suggest that there's more to it, and it's all going on in his head. What do you think, my Mercurial mercenaries? Go and listen to Lovely Rita and tell me what you think it's about. Am I reading too much into it? Am I? Anyway, to sum up, I think this album has been lifted by Giles Martin, and it's been made more available for the people of today. And I think you've got here a classic album that sounds like it could have been recorded today, and it does impress. It's perhaps not the Beatles' best album, but if anything, this new remaster shows that it has every right to be held up as one of the greatest albums of all time. And for that, Giles doesn't deserve some of the criticism he's getting, because I certainly wouldn't necessarily want to be put in charge of such a tricky task. Although I'd take the job if they offered it to me. What the hell? I wouldn't mind remixing Revolver if anyone wants to give it to me. Okay. Thank you. Kind of talked myself out there. Go and listen to the new version of Sgt. Pepper. Tell me what you think below. Do you think it's great? Do you think it stinks? Do you think I stink? Give me a thumbs down. Give me a thumbs down. Thank you, my Mercurial mercenaries. Over and out.